The Henry N. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington presents World Focus, a continuing series on international political, social, economic, and cultural issues.
Hello, my name is Martin Jaffe. I'm this year acting chair of the Jewish Studies program at the University of Washington, and it's my pleasure to introduce the 1988-89 lectures sponsored by Samuel and Althea Stroum in Jewish Studies. This year's lecturer was Michael A. Meyer of Hebrew Union College, professor of modern Jewish history. His lectures were entitled Jewish Identity in the Modern World, Its Nature and Dynamics. Before I introduce Professor Meyer and say a few words about his lectures, I thought it would be appropriate to simply remind us all of the nature of the series, the lecture series in which he's offering his presentation today. The Samuel and Althea Stroum lectures have been continuing without break since 1975-1976, when the first lectures were offered. There have since been 14 lectures, including those of Professor Meyer this past month. A number of the lectures, as you may know, have already been published, some very, very influentially. Professor Yosef Yerushalmi, who spoke in 1982-83, published his lectures as Zachor, a book which has received wide distribution, has been translated into 5 languages. I suppose that has perhaps been the most successful. We're very happy to announce that Robert Alter's lectures of 1986-87 have been published as The Invention of Hebrew Prose by the University of Washington Press, Modern Fiction and the Language of Realism, and that book has been reviewed very, very positively already, just having come out. A second lecture is already in press. A new lecture is already in press, that of William Deaver, who spoke in 1985 on recent archaeological discoveries and biblical research, and that volume should be out very, very shortly, and I hope you'll be looking for it. We have now published, I believe, 6 of the lectures, and they are now an impressive addition to the University of Washington's publication record in Jewish studies, and we're very proud of them. Just a few words about the lectures which you're about to view, those of Michael Meyer. Michael Meyer himself has become a very important and internationally recognized scholar in the history of modern Judaism and of the Jews in modern times. One of his more important works is a volume that came out in the late 60s at Wayne State University Press called The Origins of the Modern Jew, in which Professor Meyer described the various intellectual and social tensions surrounding emancipation in the late 18th century, which contributed to the kind of strategies of self-identification that Jews would choose, particularly in Germany and following the German model throughout the modern world from the 19th well into the 20th century. More recently, Professor Meyer has published a very important history of the movement of Reform Judaism called Response to Modernity, A History of the Reform Movement in Judaism. That was published by Oxford University Press just this past year and has received excellent notices. Professor Meyer's lectures for us this year have been entitled Jewish Identity in the Modern World, Its Nature and Dynamics. And here Professor Meyer proposes to sum up for us a good 15 years of his research on the study of modern Jewry and the various systems of Judaism or ideologies of Jewish identity, which the Jews in modern times have constructed for themselves by way of connecting their present, which is in many cases very, very discontinuous with the past, to some version of the past which they have chosen for themselves. The lectures, as you might have heard, have been very successful this year in particular. Professor Meyer spoke to standing room only crowds, and I think all those who attended found that it was a truly magnificent presentation Professor Meyer speaks beautifully, thinks deeply, and inspired all of us with the whole project of modern Jewish identity. And I hope those of you who are viewing his lectures on video will enjoy them as much as we did, who were privileged to attend. And without any further introduction, let me invite you to enjoy the 1988-89 Stroum Lectures by Michael A. Meyer. Thank you very much.
Tonight, I hope to show that it is anti-Semitism, which often tends to keep Jews within the Jewish circle, or if they are outside of it, sometimes pushes them back in. I hope it will become apparent that anti-Semitism's influence on individual Jews and on Jewish communities in the modern world is ambiguous. That is to say, one cannot predict it easily in each case. By devaluing Jews in the eyes of non-Jews, and hence some Jews also in their own eyes, anti-Semitism may produce mild or severe negations of self, or it may have the opposite effect, resulting in renewed affirmation of Jewish identity. Thus, anti-Semitism sometimes serves to abet the influence of enlightenment by adding negative reasons for abandoning Jewishness to positive ones. But it can also act as a counterforce, undermining the rationalism and universalism upon which enlightenment is built, and introducing a newfound identification with fellow victims of discrimination and persecution. As we shall see, anti-Semitism in given historical situations may work in both ways at once, weakening Jewish identity for some at the same time that it strengthens it for others. Now, this ambiguity with regard to anti-Semitism is wholly, I would suggest, a product of Jewish modernity. Among pre-modern Jews, anti-Semitism rarely attenuated Jewish identity. It served rather to reinforce it. For anti-Semitism was believed to be part of the divine plan which God had determined for Israel. Exiled from the Holy Land on account of their sins, Jews expected to suffer at the hands of the Gentiles until such a time as the Messiah would come and put an end to their travails. The nations of the earth who tormented them were simply actors on the stage of that drama, God's agents in the way that God dealt with God's chosen people. What Gentiles thought of the Jews, to our medieval ancestors, really didn't matter. Their views were unable to puncture the firm belief that Jews continue to be the chosen people, theologically at the very center of world history, even as that history swirled about them and made them the objects of history rather than its subjects. The Gentiles' perspective on the Jews in medieval times was, of course, very different. They understood the Jews' suffering as to be just punishment for their rejection of Christ, and they expected that in the end, that suffering would result in their conversion to Christianity. But a Jew could not share that view, which was fundamentally opposed to his own, without ceasing entirely to be a Jew. Thus, the more Jews were persecuted, the more they clung to their own faith. If necessary, they would die as martyrs in sanctification of God's holy name. Now, to be sure, there were some exceptional instances even then. In medieval Spain, barriers between Jews and Muslims, and later between Jews and Christians, had not been as high as they were elsewhere. Greek philosophy, mediated through Islam, had influenced a segment of Iberian Jewry to think in universal and rational terms, to the point that the particular rituals and even beliefs of Judaism, to some of them, seemed to be of little consequence. When the situation of Spanish Jewry deteriorated in the late 14th century, and Jews in various communities were offered their choice of the cross or the sword in 1391, many Spanish Jews chose Christianity. Others converted even without extreme coercion during the following century. They could, after all, be Aristotelians in Christian garb as well as Jewish. Some remained secretly Jewish, but even these were ready to pretend they were Christians in order to save their lives. Spanish Jewry thus foreshadows the modern period, a time when identification with non-Jewish values leaves Jewishness, and not just Jews, vulnerable to anti-Semitism. It was the European Enlightenment, however, which, as we have seen on Tuesday evening, inaugurated the identity crisis for modern Jews, as it drew them to new perspectives from which they began to question the content of their Jewishness. Its promise of equality for all humankind extracted the vigor from their belief in their own theological centrality. They could no longer see the nations of the earth as simply tools in the hand of God to chastise God's people. But if the Gentiles were not mere instruments, then perhaps their views as people mattered. As long as those views bespoke acceptance of the Jews and their integration into society, they didn't produce severe identity problems. Judaism might have to stress its universal foundations a bit more in order to fit in, as Mendelssohn sought to do. And there might be some disagreement about the shape that Judaism would assume in the modern world. But one could grow up as a Jew without a sense of shame about one's origins and affiliation. From the start, however, acceptance was in fact mingled with rejection. The enticements of enlightenment balanced by the rejections of anti-Semitism. More cruelly, periods of relative tolerance fostered hopes of true equality, weakening particular Jewish identification. But then came renewed rejection, just when the armor of self-assurance had been put aside. Charges to which Jews had earlier been invulnerable, Jewish exclusiveness or deviant ethnic characteristics, now cut them to the quick. For once they had begun to identify with the thinking of non-Jews in matters of science and philosophy and art, it was not easy then to declare, you're right in all these things, but in your prejudice against the Jews, you're wrong. To varying degrees and increasing numbers, modern Jews began to agree with the anti-Semites' image of their own group, with mild or severe consequences for their Jewish identity. The milder consequences have been so widespread among modern Jews, you'll recognize a few of them, as you will see, that it's possible to speak of them in general terms without reference to specific individuals or events. Most common has been the division Jews make between good Jews and bad Jews. The former, the good ones, are the ones with which we can identify. They tend to be those least subject to criticism by Gentiles. They are clean, soft-spoken, assimilated, hard-working, scrupulously moral. They contribute to society, but don't push themselves forward too much. Reading of their accomplishments in the newspapers instills inordinate pride and pleasure. The bad Jews represent the mirror image and nemesis of the good ones. One is embarrassed by them, for one realizes that their behavior is condemned or ridiculed by the majority culture, while unfortunately they bear one's own name of Jew. Consequently, there is a need to dissociate oneself from them, for they encourage the anti-Semitism that is bound to strike down the good Jews, like us, along with the bad ones. Hypersensitivity to the actions of the bad Jew is the counterpart of exaggerated satisfaction in the accomplishments of the good Jew. Anti-Semitism draws scrutiny also to the self. The Jew who feels rebuffed by Gentiles inevitably asks, was it I who erred by some inappropriate word or act? Or was it my Jewishness that gave offense, irrespective of what I may have said or done? The effect of this uncertainty is a recurrent anxiety that taxes emotional equilibrium. It arouses fear that a false move may produce the prejudiced judgment on the part of a Gentile who says, "Ha, that indeed is what one would expect from a Jew." The result is strenuous effort to disguise one's Jewish identity, to prevent it from being your calling card. Only after one's virtue has been established is it permissible to transmit knowledge of one's Jewishness, knowing that at the very least, the anti-Semite will then acknowledge you as an exception to his rule about Jews. A few sample strategies will illustrate the point. Certain family and personal names are decidedly Jewish. They telegraph the Jewish identity of their bearer. Those Jews most concerned with their image in the sight of non-Jews have changed Cohen and Levy to Corbett and Lane, Abraham and Moses to Albert and Morris. When the Austrian prime minister once asked the Jewish deputy from Galicia, Joseph Bloch, whether Archbishop Theodor Cohen of Olmütz had really converted to Christianity, he replied, "Never fear, Your Excellency. If he were still a Jew, he would no longer be called Cohen." A similar attempt at disguise is the alteration of prominent physical characteristics that mark one as Jewish. The social psychologist Erik Erikson, who has much influenced my own approach to the question of identity, relates the case of a psychiatric patient whose prominently Jewish nose made him feel sincerely, quote, that the only savior for the Jews would be a plastic surgeon, end quote. Like the straightening of curly hair among blacks, the nose job among Jews serves to reduce the obviousness of minority identity and enable them to believe they removed a symbol that shouts Jew before they can present their personal identity for judgment to the Gentile. A less extreme way of hiding Jewishness is to overcompensate for Gentile prejudice by taking on character traits at the furthest remove from the Jewish stereotype. For example, dressing immaculately, having impeccable manners, and things of that sort. Perhaps the most common and widespread disguise is simply the attempt not to give away Jewish identity too early in a relationship by some obviously Jewish word, gesture, or reference. Thus, anti-Semitic prejudice produces heightened Jewish self-consciousness in the presence of Gentiles, which results in the endeavor to keep Jewishness as invisible as possible for as long as possible to the untrustworthy outsider whose favor is sought. Yet, this fear of rejection also has a social effect that tends to strengthen Jewish identity. In the desire to escape the anxiety of being a Jew in the social world of Gentiles, Jews have preferred to mix socially with one another. Even as the presence of Gentiles has made Jews ill at ease, they have felt more comfortable among fellow Jews where they could let their hair down and not feel that they had to be on best behavior. Remarkably, even those modern Jews who gave up official identification with Jews entirely by converting to Christianity often associated almost exclusively with fellow converts. In Germany, they were called Taufjuden, baptized Jews. They hadn't really become Christians. They had simply taken on a borderline identity in which they still feared the verdict of the people who were born Christians. In retrospect, Jewish embarrassments of this kind seem to have been especially prevalent at times when anti-Semitism was moderately strong, but not so virulent as to make the attempt to gain acceptance futile. In present-day America, both the lower level of social anti-Semitism and, from the Jewish side, the decreased sensitivity to, as one says in Hebrew, ma yomru hagoyim, what will the Gentiles say, following the Holocaust and in the period of the State of Israel, have reduced the anxiety. In fact, one can now detect an opposite reaction in the appearance of large and prominently worn Jewish symbols, especially the Magen David and the 5-pound chai. For many contemporary Jews, hiding their Jewishness has given way to flaunting it. Now, in the more in the more densely anti-Semitic atmosphere of 19th century Germany, the effects of Jew hatred sometimes produced the extreme and pathological phenomenon that has been called Jewish self-hatred. The term has been defined in various ways, either broadly or more narrowly. I wish to use it here in a narrow sense, meaning a loathing of that in oneself which one deems to be Jewish and wishes to expunge, but somehow can't. It is, to use the language of Lady Macbeth, crying, "Out, damned spot, out, I say," and yet the spot of Jewishness remains, and one somehow feels sullied by it. In the psyche of creative individuals, this ineradicable awareness of one's somehow filthy Jewishness can result in a structure of ideas so far removed from reality as to allow of no other explanation than pathology. Two prominent examples will illustrate the point. However one may judge the validity of Karl Marx's economic and political writings, his early essay on the Jewish question is so eccentric as to beggar rational explanation. Marx was nominally a Christian from the age of 6, when his father brought the entire family to the baptismal font. But a grandfather and an uncle were rabbis, and there were rabbis on both sides of his genealogy. Marx knew very little about Judaism, but not only was he obviously aware of his origins, he was reminded of them repeatedly by his political opponents. In turn, he branded such of his rivals as were Jewish with demeaning epithets like Jüdchen, Jüdel, or Itzik. He remained silent during the pogroms directed against the Jews of Russia in 1881. Later Jewish apologists tried to make Marx somehow a Jew in spite of himself, pointing to his prophetic heritage or his messianic striving. But Marx himself never saw his writings as in any way a part of Jewish tradition. In his 1844 essay, entitled On the Jewish Question, the young Marx drew his definition of Judaism from the anti-Semitic writer Ludwig Feuerbach. Judaism, Marx claimed, was not a religion or a peoplehood, but the egoistic desire for gain, the love of money. What is the worldly basis for Judaism, Marx asks, and he answers, practical necessity, selfishness. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Barter. What is his worldly God? Money. The Jew, in other words, was capitalism incarnate. Marx remained blind to the existence of a Jewish proletariat that was especially numerous in Eastern Europe. Incredibly, he equated Jew with bourgeois speculator. But Marx went further. Not alone the historical Jew is a Jew in Marx's new sense. Christians, insofar as they are capitalists, in essence become Jews. To again quote Marx, the practical Jewish spirit has become the practical spirit of the Christian nations. Money, then, is the jealous God of Israel, and that God has become the Lord of the universe. Jews are despicable because the bourgeois society which they epitomize is despicable. The emancipation from capitalism, which for Marx was, of course, the bane of modern society, is also then the emancipation from Judaism. Marx has projected his own non-acceptance of his Jewish origins upon society as a whole. He need not feel guilty about rejecting the Jewish traditions of his family, for Jewishness is but egoism and avarice. Moreover, being Jewish is not his problem alone. All who participate in capitalist society are more or less Jews. Thus, all must trade a wretched Jewish identity for the worldwide fellowship of the proletariat. Though historically far less significant than Karl Marx, Otto Weininger also was an original thinker whose work was widely read by contemporaries and continues even today, which will be hard for you to believe after I tell you what Weininger said, to be the object of serious academic discussion. Weininger lived out his short life in fin de siècle Austria, the gay capital of sensuality, the seedbed of psychoanalysis, and the hotbed of anti-Semitism. He studied philosophy and a variety of sciences at the University of Vienna, where he received his doctorate in 1902. On the same day, he converted to Protestant Christianity. In May 1903, Weininger published a book entitled Sex and Character, work that made him famous. But only 4 months later, he committed suicide at the age of 23. As far as is known, Weininger's relations with his family were not difficult. His father, who also converted, along with Weininger's sisters, esteemed his son highly. The young Weininger seems not to have had any special problem with things Jewish, yet he was an intensely troubled person who was driven to define Jewishness no less oddly than did Marx. In his book, Sex and Character, 3 influences predominate. Plato, from whom Weininger takes the conception of ideal types; Kant, who gives him the ethic of uncompromising fulfillment of duty; and Christianity, from which he draws the transcendence of nature and the divine soul in human beings. Weininger's first objective is to create a dichotomy of ideal types of man and woman. Man alone, he argues, possesses logic, ethics, aesthetics. Man alone has a soul and a mind. Sexuality is only a portion of his makeup. Woman, by contrast, lives only unconsciously and selfishly, lacking all the positive attributes of the man. She is wholly sexual. In philosophical terms, man is form and woman is matter. An actual woman may possess some of the qualities associated with men, but to the extent that she does, she ceases to be a woman. Judaism, too, is a Platonic idea. Weininger tells us that it is neither a race, nor a people, nor a recognized creed. Sounds like Marx. I think of it, he says, as a psychological constitution, which is a possibility for all mankind, but which has become actual in the most conspicuous fashion only among the Jews. Judaism is saturated with, you guessed it, femininity. Like the woman, the Jew is amoral, capable neither of great goodness nor of great evil. He is much absorbed in sexual matters, especially matchmaking, which is the special province of women. Because the Jew, like the woman, lacks a soul, he is beguiled by such soulless doctrines as materialism, Darwinism, and Spinozistic determinism. The present age, Weininger informs his readers, suffers from the linked maladies of feminism, femininity, and Judaism. Both must be overcome for the sake of humanity. By sustained moral effort, the individual Jew can vanquish his amoral Judaism. In practice, that means becoming a Christian, for Christ is the great exemplar of the Jew who transcended his Jewishness. By a similar effort, individual women can overcome their femininity. They must cease allowing men to use them as sexual objects. Only then, in their chastity, can they become, as it were, men. I told you this was off the wall. Weininger was sufficiently insightful to recognize that he was projecting outward the very qualities that he hated and feared in himself. He himself wrote the following: "Whoever detests the Jewish character detests it first of all in himself. That he persecutes it in others is merely his attempt to separate himself in this way from what is Jewish. He strives to sever himself from it by locating it in his fellow creatures, and so for a moment to imagine himself free of it. Hatred, like love, is a projected phenomenon. You hate that person who you feel reminds you unpleasantly of yourself, end quote. Of course, projection is exactly what Weininger engaged in. Beset by a troublesome awareness of his Jewish origins and a rational guilt over his sensuality, Weininger linked Judaism and sexuality as the bane of modern society from which it must liberate itself for its own moral welfare. Thus, Weininger was able temporarily to divest the inner struggle of its painful effect by removing it to the public sphere. The parallel between Marx and Weininger should now be wholly apparent. Each of them created a mythical Judaism closely linked to those qualities of character from which he was trying desperately to escape. Egoism in the one case, lust in the other. Neither man succeeded. Even today, Marx continues to be thought of, at least in some circles, as a Jew, in a sense very different from the one that he defined, while Weininger has become the parade example of Jewish self-hatred. During the 19th century, anti-Semitism in Europe continued in two forms. Consistently, it remained beneath the surface in the form of varying degrees of official and unofficial discrimination, to a greater extent in Eastern than in Western Europe. And from time to time, it drew major attention to itself through an incident, legal setbacks, or outbreaks of violence. In both forms, it played an ambiguous role. Among those Jews whom Enlightenment had drawn furthest from Judaism, the knowledge that their Judaism would always be a hindrance to their careers and a continuing source of anxiety in the presence of Gentiles induced efforts to shield or disguise their identity as best they could, and in extreme instances, to flee from it through conversion. But ongoing discrimination also kept most Russian Jews within the clearly defined pale of settlement and for long out of contact with European culture. And it closed Gentile social circles to Jews in the West. Thus, it tended to reinforce Jewish identifications for large numbers. As it had in pre-modern times, anti-Semitism in the 19th century and early 20th centuries continued to shore up Jewish identity by creating external barriers to assimilation. However, the specific influence of anti-Semitism on Jewish identity in this period can best be evaluated by examining those occasions when it gains in prominence, calling particular attention to itself, and requiring Jews to acknowledge and deal with its renewed virulence. For the Jews of Germany, the first such occasion arose during the period of political reaction following the final defeat of Napoleon in 1815. Having served in the wars of liberation against the French, these German Jews expected confirmation of their emancipation, but encountered instead new restrictions, anti-Jewish propaganda, and in 1819, outbreaks of violence. It was a turn of events that stung them to the quick. Their Jewish shell punctured by the force of enlightenment, they were now far more vulnerable to enmity than previous generations had been. In Berlin, conversions, which began to rise sharply at the beginning of the century, now reached unprecedented heights. For these men and women, Judaism was not sufficiently valued to be worth the sacrifice of a coveted career or even social exclusion. For others, the response was to reshape Jews and Judaism by planing away the ragged edges that offended Gentile eyes. They spoke of regeneration and reform, cited universalistic passages from Jewish texts, and argued that Judaism was a faith that avowed loyalty to the state in which Jews lived. They tried to show that they could relate to their tradition with the academic detachment and scientific scholarship that prevailed in the universities. All of these responses were, of course, partly prompted by the internalization of just those values that their opponents had accused them of lacking. But the renewed atmosphere of rejection lent an urgency to their striving that sometimes robbed it of its dignity. Resurgent anti-Semitism did not allow the process of modernization to run its natural course. Not what was best for the Jews and Judaism, but what would diminish anti-Semitism often became the dominant consideration. In Eastern Europe, an outbreak of pogroms and new restrictive laws, which both followed upon the assassination of the relatively liberal Tsar Alexander II in 1881, were like a hammer blow that scattered sparks in all directions. Masses of Jews now emigrated to the United States. Others, leaving their traditional practice behind, developed new Jewish identities harmonizable, here in America, with American democracy. Others remained secure in the shelter of a traditional Judaism, which the brief and limited Enlightenment in Russia had penetrated for only relatively few. Smaller numbers turned away to revolutionary socialism, or combined socialism with some degree of Jewish ethnic identity, and a few became Zionists. Thus, in Russia, the new enmity hastened dispersion and the multiplication of identity-defining Jewish ideologies. In Germany and Austria, the legally secured and complete political emancipation gained in the late 1860s came under attack little more than a decade later. By the 1880s and 1890s, the liberal tide of the preceding 2 decades had reversed itself, and German-speaking Jews once again, as in the year 1815, felt renewed pressure. This time, they were in some respects less vulnerable, and in some respects more so. Over the course of half a century, they had learned to adapt to their peculiar status. Their religious ideologies were now less open to charges of exclusivism, their religious practices more Occidental in form. Judaism had proven its capacity to adjust to and survive in modern Europe. But for much larger numbers than in 1815, Jewish identity had worn away at the center and become peripheral. Once again, and this time in larger numbers given the increase in Jewish population, the most estranged bowed to the pressure and converted. In Vienna, the rate was especially high. Other Jews, as alienated from Judaism as the converts, refrained from following the same path simply because they thought it dishonorable to let sheer opportunism motivate the exchange of one's religious identity for another's. They despised the converts less for having abandoned anything valuable than for giving in to bigotry. Their own essentially contentless Jewish identity became known in German as Trutzjudentum, a Judaism of defiance or of spite. It consisted simply of the stubborn refusal to let anti-Semitism determine their actions. The new anti-Semitism also operated as a divisive force. It inclined German Jews to find scapegoats. Who was responsible for this anti-Semitism? The most obvious candidates, of course, for the German Jews were the Ostjuden, the recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, who were the least assimilated in speech and in conduct. Repeatedly, German Jews blamed repeatedly German Jews blamed the Ostjuden for spoiling their carefully cultivated image and distanced themselves from the newcomers, just as the Sephardim had from the Ashkenazim a century earlier. Other voices accused opposing religious factions. The Orthodox Jewish press blamed the Reform or liberal Jews for bringing down God's wrath in the form of new anti-Semitism, while liberal Jews claimed it was all the fault of the Orthodox for remaining too visibly different. Jewish writers of various backgrounds admitted that what the most prominent anti-Semites said about the Jews had some truth with regard to some Jews. In replying to anti-Semitic writers, they bent over backwards to meet them halfway. In agreeing that Jews still required improvement, they succumbed to the judgment of their opponents. However, both in the short term and the long, the resurgence of anti-Semitism in Germany also worked to shore up Jewish identity. Even individuals who were least assertive in their Jewishness were driven to take sides, raising their level of Jewish awareness. Indifferent Jews became, as one writer said, quote, Jews by the grace of the anti-Semite Adolf Stöcker. Remarkably, the anti-Semitism of 1880 even prompted a small Jewish revival. That year, for the very first time, Jewish banking houses in Berlin took the unprecedented step of sending out a circular informing all their customers that they would be closed this year on the 2 days of the new year and on the Day of Atonement. A Jewish newspaper claimed that the anti-Semitic agitation had notably increased the extent of Jewish identification, and more than one rabbi got up on his pulpit and talked about the positive influence of anti-Semitism, which was nothing less than providential. The longer-term results were more significant. When anti-Semitism persisted, the German Jews in 1893 finally created a national organization whose chief purpose would be defending the Jews against their enemies. The Central Association of German Citizens of the Jewish Faith soon became, and remained until Nazi times, the largest organization of German Jews. While it continued to invest its energies principally in the defense of Jewish rights, the organization increasingly fostered both Jewish pride and a broader and deeper Jewish identity. In Germany, the ambiguous impact of anti-Semitism on Jewish identity came to an end during the 1930s. Nazism differed from previous anti-Semitisms in closing off the escape route of greater assimilation or even conversion. Since the Nazi criteria for Jewishness were essentially racial, converts to Christianity of Jewish parentage were subject to the same discrimination as the most Orthodox Jews. The state now forced Jewish identity on those whom it defined as Jews, regardless of their own feelings. No matter what they did, unless they were able to leave Germany or chose to commit suicide, as increasing numbers now did, German Jews were unable to remove themselves from the reference group to which they were assigned. They could subjectively reject their externally imposed identity and continue to maintain that to varying degrees they were really ex-Jews. But to do so meant to create an untenable rift between the way Jews were treated, formally and informally on the one hand, and their own self-conception on the other. Even the disguise of obvious Jewishness through Gentile names was now blocked when the Nazis insisted that every male Jew add the name Israel and every female Jew the name Sarah to their names. Few were the instances of individuals who could maintain a subjective consciousness of being no longer or only minimally a Jew, despite that objective mark placed on all members of the Jewish race. The more common response was to look inward at a Jewish interior landscape that had long ago grown barren. Nazi anti-Semitism before the Holocaust thus had the general effect of restoring Jewish consciousness where it had eroded severely. The most assimilated of German Jews, often for the first time in their lives, now felt the need to confront and to reaffirm their Jewishness. At the age of 24, the Nobel Prize-winning German Jewish chemist Fritz Haber had converted to Protestantism for the sake of his career. As the head of an important scientific institute, he became an influential figure, especially after he succeeded in developing, of all things, poison gas for the German army in World War I. But as a racial Jew, Haber was forced into resigning his position in 1933. Nazism made Haber and many others like him Jews in spite of themselves. To Albert Einstein, Fritz Haber wrote, quote, "In my whole life, I have never been so Jewish as I am now." Some German Jews in the early 30s, if they could, left Germany for Palestine or the United States. Those who remained behind sought to fill their externally imposed Jewish identity with Jewish content. Synagogues that had stood nearly empty during the Weimar Republic times, filled with Jews who sought them out as refuges from the hostility that they encountered in daily life. Prayers long forgotten assumed new meaning as the people of Israel once again became a people apart. Jewish education experienced a revival as Jewish children were expelled from the general schools or their lives there made odious by the harassments of the Hitler Youth. In Berlin and elsewhere, Jewish cultural institutions became the focus of widespread interest. During its most difficult years, German Jewry embarked upon a remarkable project to re-educate itself to an ineluctable Jewish identity. In retrospect, one writer termed this effort paradoxically, construction on the eve of destruction. In France, too, during the brief period between Nazi occupation and deportation, there arose a new sense of the common destiny of the Jewish people, which pushed aside long-standing antagonisms that existed between the native French and East European Jews who had migrated there. In Poland, Nazi-imposed ghettoization did not expunge the differences among established Jewish parties of differing ideologies, but there as well external pressure, now in the form of physical segregation in Warsaw and Vilna and other places, brought those Jews who had strayed the furthest back into the Jewish fold. At least at first, Jewish life in the teeming ghettos was remarkably vibrant. Of course, whether in Germany, France, or Eastern Europe, this revival of Jewish consciousness was short-lived. The worsening situation soon undermined morale and drove up the rate of suicide. For many, the reaffirmation of their Jewishness came only on the eve of an unwilled martyrdom. Yet just as ironically as Nazism had initially given the impulse to a deepened Jewishness, so the Holocaust eventually became a major factor in sustaining Jewish identity after World War II. Jewish leaders in the United States early called for a revitalized American Jewish community that would be capable of compensating in some measure for the loss of the great centers in Eastern Europe. Later, in particular following the Eichmann trial of 1961, Holocaust awareness increasingly became a major portion of what it meant to be Jewish, especially in the diaspora. Few American Jews were survivors in the literal sense, but the notion that every Jew living in the post-Holocaust age was a kind of survivor gained increasing acceptance. Whereas before the Shoah, American Jewish identity was for most Jews either a religiously based morality or a loose bond of ethnic solidarity. The rise in awareness of the Holocaust produced in many individuals a much more determined Jewishness. They were bent on preventing the identity Hitler sought to expunge through physical destruction from succumbing to the subtler pressures of assimilation. In Western Europe, greater geographical proximity to the events resulted in a closer focus on the Holocaust and a sense of building upon the ruins of the Jewries that were destroyed. Even in the Soviet Union, recollection of the catastrophe became a focal point for Jewish revival in Russia, beginning in the early 1960s. Anti-Semitism in the contemporary Jewish diaspora, and especially in the United States, has thus ceased to be ambiguous in its effect. Neither the memory of the Holocaust nor the relatively low levels of current discrimination are driving Jews to hide their Jewishness, let alone to apostatize. On the contrary, anti-Semitism, especially as collective memory, serves as a basic motive for Jewish identification today. The erosive forces at present come exclusively from the Enlightenment side, from the absence of barriers that makes easier the contact between Jews and non-Jews. Jews do not, as before the Holocaust, marry Gentiles to escape the odium of discrimination. If they intermarry, as they continue to do in ever-increasing numbers, it is rather because universal values have displaced particularism in both communities. Thus, in their effect on Jewish identity, Enlightenment and anti-Semitism have now come into direct opposition. Yet contemporary Jewishness is not, and in the long run cannot be, sustained by the memory and fear of external threat alone. And indeed, the dynamics of Jewish identity also includes a force that sustains that identity from within. Its symbol is Zion.